Now, so complete was this idea that the court would no longer substitute their will for the will of democratically elected legislature, or they would no longer Lochner that a mere 5 years later, they said in a case of Wickard versus Filburn, they had this to say about the extent of that. So what was happening is, with the Great Depression, Congress had passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act. What the act did was that it gave farmers money not to plant a portion of their crops. One of the things that caused the Great Depression was there was too much agricultural produce out there. Farmers were producing more and more and more, which was driving down the price. Farmers couldn't feed themselves, as it were, almost. They had plenty of food, just no plenty of money to get what they needed. And so Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which paid them not to grow a portion of their land. Well, this farmer named Wickard, he had a great idea. He was going to take the money that Congress offered not to grow a portion of his land, and he was going to plant it anyway. And then he was going to use the stuff that he planted on that portion, to feed his family, to feed his cows, to provide seed for next year. And so the question becomes, is that constitutional? Does Congress have the authority to do that? Does Congress have the authority to not give him the money once they said they're going to do that, and he's just growing it on the home? And so this is what the court says. He said the question, now remember, we're looking at this from the perspective of how far will the court defer to the legislature based on what they said in West Coast Hotel versus Parrish. Speaking of that, West Coast Hotel versus Parrish, before I forget, let me go back to this right here. The switch in time that saved 9. Why is it called that? It is called the switch in time that saved 9 because Robert Owens, as I said earlier, who had been voting with the majority to declare much of this new deal legislation unconstitutional, he switched his vote. That killed the court packing scheme of FDR. And so his switch in time, his switch in voting, saved 9. There was no need then for FDR to try and pack the court to get the court to rule the way he wanted to. And so hence the expression that political scholars have about the West Coast Hotel versus Parrish was that it was a switch in time that saved 9. So now back to Wickard versus Filburn. He says, the court said, the question would merit little consideration except for the fact that this act extends federal regulation to production not intended in any part of commerce, but wholly for consumption on the farm. And then it gets to the portion of the Constitution that deals with this. They said the commerce power. Remember, that was one of the powers that everybody agreed the Constitution Convention and the Congress needed, the power to control interstate commerce. The commerce power is not confined in its exercise to regulation of commerce among the states. It extends, meaning between. It extends to those activities interstate, meaning within. So intrastate commerce is within, interstate commerce is between. So it extends to those activities intrastate commerce, which so affect interstate commerce. So the court is drawing here an expansive view of interstate commerce. It's saying even things that happen solely interstate can still affect interstate commerce and therefore be under Congress's prerogative to legislate. Now, here's where logically they're getting to that conclusion. The appellee's own contribution to the demand for wheat may be trivial by itself, is not enough. So that portion of the land that he promised he wouldn't plant, says it's the court is saying that's trivial by itself. But that's not enough to remove it from the scope of federal regulation, whereas here, his contribution taken together with that of many others similarly situated is far from trivial. So if all the farmers did that, the very purpose of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which seeks to get produce goods to be higher priced, would come to naught. And so because of this, the court is arguing, that gives power to Congress to control those things intrastate, which affect intrastate. But if we assume that it is never marketed, it supplies a need for the man who grew it, which would otherwise be reflected by purchases in the open market. Homegrown wheat, in this sense, competes with wheat in the commerce. Another thing they also said in this case, they said, if it is interstate commerce that feels the pinch, does not matter how local the operation that applies the squeeze. And so what they were doing, what the court was saying here, is they were not going to Lochner-ize. There was a logical reason. This was within the power of Congress to do this. It was not their job to sit as a super legislature to determine the wisdom, need, or propriety of this law. Was it within Congress's power? Yes. End of story. Next case. So much so there's where you're coming from with this idea that there's no longer going to Lochner-ize. But just a year after West Coast Hotel versus Paris, which was 1937, the court said they're no longer going to Lochner-ize, but they couldn't help themselves. So in the United States versus Caroline Products, and you don't even really need to know what's going on in the case here. What is important about this case is what becomes known as infamous footnote number 4, in which the court said, in some instances, we may Lochner-ize. They didn't say it in those words, but that's what they said. So here's what it says. There may be a narrower scope for operation of the presumption of the constitutionality when legislation appears on its face to be within a specific prohibition of the Constitution, such as those of the first 10 amendments, which are deemed equally specific when held to be embraced within the 14th Amendment. So let me stop right there and explain this idea that now the first 10 amendments are deemed to be held, the states now have to confide by them. So what happened in a case called Benjamin Getlow, the court changed its mind and said, hey, the 14th Amendment, based on what the 14th Amendment said, that no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. They said, based on that the 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, now apply to the state governments as well. So if you look at this, statement here in United States versus Caroline Products, it's saying there's a narrow scope of operation. When you look and see if something is within a specific prohibition of the Constitution, well, duh, it should be. It should be. If it's a violation of the Constitution, then they shouldn't condone it. But then they go on and they say this: nor need we inquire whether similar considerations enter into the review of statutes directed at particular religious or racial minorities, whether prejudice against discrete and insular minorities may be a special condition which tends to seriously to curtail the operation of those political processes ordinarily to be relied upon to protect minorities, and which may call for a correspondingly more searching judicial inquiry. Now, what is a minority? What they're talking about here is political minority. Political minority is anybody who's not in the majority. Gun owners could become a political minority. Whatever right you think you have, but you don't have, you're a political minority. So they're saying here, wait a second, maybe where there are discrete and insular minorities are concerned, maybe we'll use this corresponding more searching judicial inquiry. Wait a second. So what they're really saying, United States versus Caroline Products, is if we don't like something, we may Lochner-ize after all. Because who are minorities? Minorities are anybody who doesn't have a majority. And so they're carving out this exception for themselves. And boom, one comes up. Skinner versus Oklahoma. Now, this stuff is so real, you can't make this stuff up. So here are the facts of Skinner versus Oklahoma. Under the Oklahoma's Habitual Criminal Sterilization Act of 1935, the state could impose a sentence of compulsory sterilization as part of their judgment against individuals who had been convicted of three more times of crimes amounting to felonies involving moral turpitude. Just baseness. The defendant, Jack T. Skinner, had been convicted once for chicken stealing and twice for armed robbery. So now should he be sterilized? According to the law, he had to be sterilized. And this comes before the Supreme Court. This was passed by the legislature of Oklahoma. They had a rational basis for doing this. Was it within their legislative prerogative? Now, remember the court said they're no longer going to Lochner-ize. But, in a sense, this was too much for them. And they go back to this infamous footnote number 4, and they say, we got to do something about this. So again, they begin to be judicial activists. The motivation behind the law was primarily eugenic, to try to weed out, quote, unfit individuals from the gene pool. Criminal sterilization laws like the one in Oklahoma were designed to target criminality believed by some at the time to be possibly a hereditary trait. Most punitive sterilization laws, including Oklahoma statute, prescribe vasectomy as a method rendering the individual infertile, which, unlike castration, does not affect sexual urge or function. So, I'm sorry, this wasn't the Supreme Court saying that, but this is what's going on. And so the idea here is they didn't want, the state didn't want them passing their genes on because at the time they believed that criminality was an inherited trait. And so the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do this. So in other words, now you may think this is wrong too, but does the Supreme Court have the power to declare it wrong? Does it run against a specific prohibition of the Constitution? Or is the remedy for this, if this is a poor law, to appeal to the legislature or to vote the legislature out and put a new one in? And why is that such a big deal? We're going to get to why it's a big deal in Griswold versus Connecticut. And we'll pick up with that in the next video.